Soft candlelight flickered across the polished marble floors of the great hall in the Red Keep, casting long dancing shadows upon columns carved in the shapes of dragons and griffins. Thick tapestries depicting triumphant battles and royal hunts hung across the walls, their colors dulled by the swirl of dust motes drifting lazily in the stagnant summer air. Servants scurried about with lowered heads, quiet as church mice. No one dared to speak above a hushed whisper in the presence of King Robert Baratheon, especially in those late hours when his temper often teetered on the edge of a roar. But tonight, there was an unsettling calm to him, a weighted silence that settled like a blanket of ominous fog. Each breath that escaped his broad chest seemed labored, each rumble in his throat a distant echo of what once had been a boisterous laugh. There had been no feast tonight, no call for minstrels or dancing girls. A small supper was served in his private dining quarters, behind a door gilded with intricate carvings of stags in flight. Those stags seemed to glare, as if they were guardians or silent witnesses to some unspoken secret concealed within. Cersei Lannister, the golden-haired queen, made her way from that chamber and into the hallway, her emerald eyes shining coldly in the torchlight. She moved with careful, deliberate steps, the train of her gown whispering against the polished floor. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, but it was devoid of warmth. She paused for a moment, glancing back at the door she had just shut. Through the thick wood, she could hear Robert's cough, the muffled sound of a goblet scraping across the tabletop. Her heart did not quicken. There was no pang of remorse in her breast. Instead, she felt only a steely resolve coursing through her veins, fueled by the knowledge of what she had done. She had spent the entire supper with him, a smirk hidden behind her goblet whenever he grumbled about his day of tedious small council meetings. He had demanded another cup of wine, swirling it around and downing half in a single gulp, and then the corner of his lip had twitched. For the briefest moment, King Robert had blinked in confusion, as though the taste of that vintage were somehow off, or his tongue had detected something strange. But he had poured the rest down his throat all the same, too oblivious or proud to question what might have been slipped into his cup. Indeed, there had been a special touch from Cersei's hand, no less than the subtle workings of a cunning alchemist from across the seas, secured by her father's gold, meant to weaken the body in small, steady increments until the mind began to slip. It was not the dramatic, instantaneous poison that caused a man to keel over in agony. This was far more insidious, a daily torment, a creeping illness that would smolder inside him for weeks. And by the time he realized something was truly amiss, by the time he sought help, it might already be too late. From the corridor leading away from Robert's private dining chamber, Cersei moved swiftly, each step echoing softly under the vaulted ceilings. A pair of Lannister guards, clad in polished lion-crested armor, stood straighter at her approach, their gazes averted as a sign of respect. She nodded to them in passing and continued on. She intended to return to her rooms, where she might finally let out a trembling breath, gather her composure, and wait. Jaime Lannister was nowhere to be seen. She knew he was on duty this night, posted somewhere near the king's apartments, yet she had not caught more than a glimpse of his golden hair all evening. Perhaps it was for the best. Some doubts, some flickers of conscience, still lingered in the edges of her mind. If she crossed paths with Jaime, she might find that hidden part of her that sometimes yearned for reassurance from someone she trusted. She might let slip a moment of guilt or regret, and that would not do. Silence accompanied her as she entered her own chambers, the wide door guarded by yet another pair of Lannister men. Inside, she found her room lit only by a single candelabra. The scents of lavender and rosewater lingered, perfumes wafting from the open window where a faint breeze drifted in from Blackwater Bay. Slipping out of her gown and into a robe of deep crimson, she stood by the window and looked out into the night sky. A thin crescent moon offered little illumination over the city's rooftops. The flickering lights of King's Landing's taverns and hovels spread out below, an ocean of glimmering embers in the darkness. Tomorrow, she told herself, the game would continue. Robert would wake, perhaps a bit more irritable, complaining of yet another headache, a dryness in his throat that no amount of ale could quench. And so it would go the next day, and the next, and the next, until one day his old war wounds, his penchant for drinking, and the subtle poison surging within him would converge. Cersei pictured the scene in her mind, a king buckling under his own weight, too proud to kneel but too weak to stand, eventually collapsing in a heap on the floors of the Red Keep. She pictured the hush, the panic, and the fear in the eyes of the court, and she pictured herself, standing above it all, calm and regal, ready to guide the Seven Kingdoms into a new era, one that bowed only to the lion and not the stag. Across the city, in his own apartments that overlooked a smaller courtyard, Pettier Baelish sat at his desk, thumbing through a ledger of expenses that was more for show than anything else. He did not appear particularly interested in the numbers scrawled upon the parchment. Instead, his attention drifted to the cool night beyond his balcony. He had eyes and ears all over King's Landing. But tonight a strange hush had fallen upon the castle grounds. Though Littlefinger had heard no rumors of note, a delicate sense of tension prickled at him. He glanced at the door as though expecting a visitor, but none came. With a slow smile, he wondered where the Queen might be at such a late hour. Sometime near midnight, the bells on the far side of the city began to toll. Robert Baratheon stirred from an uneasy slumber. After Cersei had left him, he'd remained slumped in his chair, the aftertaste of a bitter wine on his tongue. A dull ache had spread across his temples, and his throat felt parched and sore. He had tried to shake it off, summoning the memory of old battles, reminding himself that he was Robert Baratheon, the usurper king, the man who had toppled House Targaryen with a mighty swing of his warhammer. Yet even as he sat there, a sheen of sweat gathered at his brow. He forced himself to rise, his large hands curling around the arms of the chair, pushing his bulky frame upward. But when he stood, he felt an odd wobble in his knees, as though the joints had momentarily threatened to buckle. Another cough rasped from him. He shot a glare around the empty room, anger flushing his cheeks. There was no one to witness his moment of weakness, but that did not soothe him. His first impulse was to demand more wine, though the rational part of his mind told him that might not be wise. He lumbered forward a step, crossing the space to the long table where the remnants of his meal lay untouched. A roast pheasant half-carved, bread and honey, and a cup of spiced wine that he had hardly touched. He hovered there, gripping the table's edge. The room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, or perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him. His heart pounded in his chest, furious as a charging bull. Fury flared within him at the idea of being unwell. He had survived countless battlefields, rebel sieges, and hunting accidents. Was he now to be undone by a trifling sickness? He forced a thick swallow, ignoring the dryness that tugged at his throat. He reached for the cup, fingertips trembling slightly against the curve of the goblet, and lifted it to his mouth. The spiced wine felt sweet enough as it slipped across his tongue, yet the bitterness that lingered afterward was worse than before. He set the cup down with a sharp clang as though offended by its taste. Then he rubbed at his eyes, swore under his breath, and trudged toward his bed. In the darkness, he collapsed onto it, one arm draped across his brow, breathing in labored puffs. Sleep claimed him in uneven waves, fractured by strange dreams of swirling shapes and distant roars. When the morning light finally filtered through the high windows, Robert Baratheon jolted awake with a moan. The air felt unreasonably hot and stale, as if someone had stoked a brazier near his face all night long. Sweat clung to his skin in droplets. He pulled himself up, cursing the stiffness in his joints. There was a painful throbbing in his head that intensified as he swung his legs to the floor. He groped for a pitcher of water on the bedside stand, poured some into a clay cup, and drank greedily. The water offered no comfort to his scratchy throat. He coughed, nearly spilling what remained in the cup, and then forced himself to stand. Dizzy, he paused to steady himself against the bedpost. It felt as though something was draining the energy from his very bones. He tried to shake off the fog in his head. He would not appear weak before his court. Summoning what remained of his famed stubbornness, he rang for a servant. A young man appeared within moments, bowing deeply, his eyes betraying the faintest hint of concern at the sight of the king's pallor. Robert demanded a bath be drawn, hot water to chase away the aches. He also demanded fresh clothes and a hearty breakfast. "And for the gods' sakes," he said with a growl, "tell the small council I will join them at midday, not a moment sooner." The servant bowed and scurried away. Robert's hand came to rest on his own broad stomach. He thought of the nights he had spent feasting, drinking, hollering at the top of his lungs. Perhaps, he told himself, it was only the weight of such indulgences that now exacted a price. Perhaps the long months of too much wine and too many hunts had caught up to him. The notion stung his pride. He recalled the days when he was young and unstoppable, how he had cleaved men in two with that great warhammer of his. But he was no longer that man. A creeping sense of fear fluttered in his chest. He swallowed hard and pushed it away, refusing to show it even to the emptiness of his bedroom. Elsewhere, in her own chamber, Cersei Lannister glanced at the mirror, set upon her vanity. Her maid was meticulously coiling her hair into braids, weaving strands of gold together in a pattern befitting a queen. She studied her own reflection. There were no telltale signs of her deed, no trembling lips or anxious eyes. She had trained herself to maintain composure, especially in the presence of watchers. Once her hair was done, and her gown, a regal emerald that complemented the flicker of green in her eyes, was properly fitted, she dismissed her maid with a curt nod. Alone once more, she stood up and smoothed the fine fabric over her hips. She knew that in a short while, Robert would appear in the throne room or the council chamber, or perhaps even in the courtyard, and she would need to play her part, the dutiful, concerned wife, full of regrets that she could not soothe him. And so the day would pass, building upon the subtle threads of suspicion that might or might not arise. Perhaps some would comment on the king's color, or the unsteadiness in his gait, but none would dare to suggest anything as bold as poison. After all, King Robert had been known for years to live too large and too recklessly. A sudden decline in health might be explained away by natural causes, or so Cersei hoped. She made her way to the Queen's ballroom, a long open space with tall windows that looked out upon the city below. This early, the hall was empty, save for a pair of guards at the far doors. Cersei moved to one of the windows, letting the bright sunlight cascade over her. She drew a quiet breath. Patience, she told herself. That was the key. Patience and subtlety. The plan would unfold in small steps, each day chipping away at Robert's vigor until it snapped like a rotted branch. Then, she could truly reign. The day drifted slowly, the hours marked by the comings and goings of courtiers and council members. Lords and ladies whispered about the king's health, for they had seen him at midday plodding through the corridors with an ashen face, sweat glistening at his temples. He had snapped at a servant carrying a tray of fruits, nearly causing the poor man to spill them all over the floor. Such rage was not unusual for the king, but there was a weakness behind his eyes that could not be disguised. Mace Tyrell, who had arrived in the city for an audience, commented on how the king must be dealing with the burdens of the crown. Varys, ever watchful, offered only a polite smile, his soft voice betraying nothing of what he truly thought. Grand Maester Pycelle cleared his throat and suggested the king retire early or take a mild tonic. Robert nearly lashed out at him for such advice, barking that he needed no old man's medicines, though everyone observed how he coughed afterward, a rattling sound that lingered too long. Cersei was the epitome of composure. She sat at Robert's side in the council chamber, wearing a gentle expression, occasionally placing a hand upon his arm as though to console him. Sometimes, in the midst of the small council's chatter, she would feel his glare upon her, as if he suspected her of something. But she met his eyes calmly, offering a faint smile that revealed nothing. If Robert did nurse any suspicions, he said nothing. Perhaps the man was too stubborn, too proud to admit the possibility that he was being undone by someone in his own household. Perhaps he could not fathom that his own queen might deliver such a betrayal. As the afternoon stretched on, the king's restlessness grew. He grunted and shifted in his seat, forehead shining with perspiration. At last, he rose, calling an abrupt end to the meeting. He demanded that Sir Barristan Selmy and a handful of guards accompany him outside, to the training yard. Robert had always been a man to test himself against others in combat, even if it was but a friendly bout of practice. There, among the clang of swords and the ring of steel, he might find some measure of relief from the tightness in his chest. And so off he went, each step heavier than usual, but spurred forward by an inner rage that demanded release. Cersei lingered in the council chamber, exchanging knowing glances with Littlefinger, who wore that perpetual smirk of his. If he suspected anything, she mused, he would not reveal it. Not yet, at least. She gave him a courteous nod and swept out of the room, her gown swirling behind her as she made her way to her private garden. Cloaked in high walls of stone and thick, ivy-covered lattice, the Queen's garden was a sanctuary of aromatic blooms and well-tended pathways. She often came here to be away from prying eyes. This time, she did so to quell the subtle tremor that was rising in her chest. Even though she had steeled her resolve, she could not deny the shiver of excitement that coursed through her veins. There was power in shaping destinies, and she reveled in the knowledge that she was the puppet master behind the king's growing illness. Her moment of stillness was disturbed when she heard a gentle cough. Turning, she saw Varys, his soft powdered cheeks and carefully folded hands giving him the appearance of an overgrown sparrow. He bowed his head slightly. "Your Grace," he intoned. She let out a small sigh. He was the master of whisperers after all, and his presence anywhere was seldom a coincidence. "Lord Varys," she replied curtly, turning back to face the garden's central fountain. A carved stone maiden poured water endlessly from an urn into the pool below. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Varys slid forward like a ghost, his steps nearly silent upon the gravel. "I merely wished to see if you might have any word on the king's condition. He seemed most unwell in the council chamber, and I fear the responsibilities of rule weigh heavily on him." He paused delicately. "Such burdens often fall upon queens as well." Cersei forced a polite smile. "His Grace is as robust as ever, Lord Varys. A bit of a chill, perhaps, nothing more. You know how men are. They refuse to admit they might be ill until it knocks them to the ground. I'm sure Robert will be back to his hunts and feasts soon enough." The eunuch bowed his head again. "Of course, Your Grace. I only hope that is the case." His voice was gentle, but behind his eyes lay a wealth of secrets. She could sense him sniffing about, trying to glean the truth. Varys' entire art was to unearth the rumors swirling in the shadows. But she had prepared herself for this. No slip of the tongue would reveal her true intentions. When he departed, Cersei lingered by the fountain a while longer, watching the shimmering water catch glints of sunlight. She wondered if Varys already had some inkling of her plot, or if he merely suspected that Robert's health might become a pivotal matter in the realm's politics. One thing was certain. If Varys smelled blood, he would do everything in his power to position himself advantageously. She just needed to ensure that, in the end, she emerged with the greatest advantage of all. Meanwhile, out in the training yard, Robert Baratheon found himself stripped to the waist beneath the glare of the sun, hefting a practice sword. It was meant to be lighter than a real blade, and safer, thick wood reinforced with strips of metal. Yet to Robert's arm, it felt heavier than any warhammer he had ever wielded in his youth. He swung it clumsily at one of the king's guard, a practice partner who easily deflected the blow. The force of the impact jarred Robert's arm all the way to the shoulder. Fury swelled in him, accompanied by a flash of pain in his chest. He swung again, growling with every strike. Sweat poured down his brow, stinging his eyes. His heart pounded wildly. It felt as though his lungs could not draw enough air. Ser Barristan, standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, perhaps that is enough for today. You seem taxed. We would not want to overexert you." Robert snarled, hurling the practice sword to the ground with a crack. He glared at Barristan, chest heaving. Then he bent over, hands braced against his thighs, struggling to regain a normal breathing rhythm. His vision blurred momentarily, dark spots dancing at the edges. He was about to bark a retort, to demand that they keep going, when his stomach turned sour. A wave of nausea swept over him. He squeezed his eyes shut, swallowing hard, and forced himself upright. He cleared his throat, sweat trickling down his temple. "I'm fine." But the ragged edge to his voice told a different story. Some of the nearby guards looked on in worry. A few lowered their gazes, pretending not to witness the king's obvious weakness. Barristan stepped forward, his voice tinged with sympathy and a soldier's concern. "Your Grace, let me call for a maester. We can have you looked at. It might just be the heat, but—" Robert cut him off, mustering the last scraps of his pride. "I said I'm fine, damn you," he growled, though the words ended with a rasping cough that made him clutch his side. He spat on the ground, furious at his own body's betrayal, and turned toward the castle. "I just need water, rest." Without waiting for assistance, he staggered out of the yard, ignoring the prying eyes that followed. Inside, the corridors felt cooler, but somehow more suffocating, as though the very walls pressed in on him. Each step was an effort. He could almost taste blood in the back of his throat, though he knew that was only the sourness of bile. When a servant hurried past, Robert seized the man by the arm. "You!" he barked. "Fetch Pycelle, quickly!" The servant nodded, eyes wide, and dashed off. Robert leaned against the wall, his vision spinning. He forced air into his lungs, cursing under his breath. He would not be mocked. He would not be pitied. Not after everything he had done, everything he had fought for. Where was his strength? Where was the unstoppable force that once shattered the skulls of Targaryen loyalists? He felt a flicker of dread, an emotion foreign to the mighty king he believed himself to be. When Grand Maester Pycelle arrived, stooping and muttering, Robert could hardly contain his impatience. The old man fussed around him, feeling his forehead, checking his pulse. Pycelle peered into Robert's eyes and asked if he was having pains in his chest or stomach. Robert, grimacing, admitted that his head pounded and his throat felt raw. Pycelle nodded sagely, muttering something about heat exhaustion and possibly a mild infection. "We'll have you take a rest and drink a tonic," he said, offering a bottle of foul-smelling liquid. "It should help with the fever and calm your body's distress. Plenty of rest, Your Grace." Plenty of rest. Robert snatched the bottle, uncaring of its stench, and pushed past Pycelle to find his own bedchamber. He wanted no crowd of sycophants watching him wobble or fall. He entered his rooms and slammed the door behind him, the echo reverberating through the hall. Alone, he steadied himself against a table and uncorked the bottle, tipping a measure of the foul syrup down his throat. It tasted of rotten fruit and bitter herbs. He gagged but forced himself to swallow. Then, with a groan, he sank onto the edge of his bed. He would not allow himself to drift to sleep yet. He simply needed a moment to gather his breath. Through the haze, he recalled Cersei's face at supper the night before, the way she had watched him over her goblet of wine. Had she seemed more attentive than usual? Or was that his imagination? A knock at the door interrupted his muddled thoughts. He barked out a command for whoever it was to enter. Cersei glided in, her expression carefully painted with concern. She wore the emerald gown from earlier, and the color of it brought out the faint green flecks in her eyes, a detail not lost on Robert as he stared at her. She approached slowly, her hands clasped before her. "Robert, I heard you weren't feeling well," she said in a voice that feigned gentle worry. "Shouldn't you be resting?" He grunted. "So says everyone in this blasted castle." He tried to rise from the bed, but something in his head swam, forcing him to sit back down abruptly. Frustration burned in his eyes. "Damn it all. I'm the king. I don't need to be coddled like some babe." "Madame," Cersei reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, almost reverent. In that moment, had Robert been in a clearer state of mind, he might have noticed the chill emanating from her fingertips, or the faint tension in her jaw that betrayed true concern was entirely absent. Instead, he saw only the facade of a caring wife. "I know you're a strong man," she soothed. "But even strong men fall ill. Let the maester help you." He snorted. "Maester Pycelle?" "Yes. He gave me some vile brew." He held up the bottle for her inspection, noticing how her gaze flicked over it momentarily. She offered a short nod, her lips pursed. Something about her expression was too controlled. Robert squinted, memories stirring, her slight smirk at dinner the previous night. The uncharacteristic calm about her. Could she have? No. The thought evaporated before it could fully take form. He was too weary, too feverish to entertain such suspicions. In that haze, The possibility of his own queen poisoning him seemed absurd, though a kernel of doubt lodged in his subconscious. Night descended slowly, casting purple shadows across the Red Keep's towers. Robert drank more of the tonic, drifting in and out of uneasy slumber. Cersei, for her part, oversaw the usual tasks of the court, ensuring that no one found it too remarkable that the king was indisposed. A few lordlings muttered their concerns, but she flashed a regal smile, promising all would be well. Her children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, were kept busy with their lessons. Joffrey, almost of age to be considered a young man, cared little for his father's well-being, focusing more on how he might impress the court. Myrcella and Tommen, too young to grasp the subtleties, only noticed that the king seemed more irritable and paler than usual. Under Cersei's direction, they remained at a distance for the time being. In the privacy of her own chamber that evening, she revisited her supply of the alchemist's poison, a tiny vial containing a powder finer than the dust on a butterfly's wing. It held no odor and dissolved easily in wine or water, leaving only the slightest bitterness that could be masked by strong flavors. She measured out a minuscule portion, no larger than a grain of sand, and carefully wrapped it in a scrap of cloth. The dosage was crucial. Too much, and Robert might fall too swiftly, raising suspicions of treachery. Too little, and he might recover. No, this had to be a slow dance with death. A lingering malady that would prompt little suspicion, for the king had grown overweight and indulgent over the years. His repeated injuries, his love of drink, his hunts, any of these would offer plausible reasons why his health might decline. So long as no one discovered her hand behind it, her victory would be assured. The next morning, when she joined Robert for a brief breakfast, an affair he barely touched, she made sure to pass him a cup of wine mixed with the slightest pinch of that powder. He gulped it down without noticing the bitterness, or if he did, he offered no comment. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn. He scarcely looked at her. She wondered if his suspicions might be growing, but when he spoke, it was only to bark about a headache. The days began to blur, each new dawn bringing fresh aches to the king. He coughed more often now, a harsh sound that rattled his lungs. His joints felt stiff, and a dull burn in the pit of his stomach made him wary of eating. The wine he consumed seemed only to intensify the sourness in his gut. Increasingly, he allowed Pycelle to administer tonics, though they did little more than dull the edges of his pain and lull him into momentary bouts of restless sleep. The court took note. Whispers circulated that the king was losing his vigor. Some blamed the unrelenting heat of the capital, others his excessive drinking. A few quietly reminded one another that Robert Baratheon had borne the wounds of war, and time had a way of claiming even the strongest men eventually. Cersei maintained her mask of concern, always at his side in public, but seldom alone with him unless she was certain his mind was dulled by fatigue or medicine. The slightest slip of her tongue, the faintest trace of malicious satisfaction, might alert him, or someone else, to the conspiracy unfolding in plain sight. She had to be cautious of various spies, Littlefinger's cunning, and the possibility that any one of the castle's servants might overhear something in the corridors. Yet day after day, her confidence grew. Each time Robert coughed into his hand and stared at the flecks of red that sometimes appeared, she knew the poison was working. Each time he grimaced, clutching his side as if stabbed by an invisible blade, she felt the adrenaline surge of impending victory. Within the Red Keep, the tension thickened. Servants spoke in hushed tones about the king's irritability, his violent outbursts that were followed by bouts of alarming weakness. At times, he nearly pitched forward in faintness. Once, while in the presence of several lords, Robert suddenly clutched his head and lurched against a column, a strangled cry escaping his lips. Everyone rushed to assist him, and though he bellowed for them to stand aside, he could not hide the trembling in his limbs. It was no longer possible to deny that King Robert was very ill. And yet, news came that Lord Eddard Stark, Warden of the North, was due to arrive in King's Landing soon. He traveled south at the king's request, a request that had been sent weeks before Robert's malady had begun in earnest. Cersei knew Ned Stark could be a problem. The man was honorable to a fault, and if anyone could sniff out treachery, it might be he. She had to ensure that Robert's condition seemed wholly natural. She had to weave a tapestry of plausible explanations that even the Honorable Stark would not unravel. As the date of Ned's arrival approached, Cersei found Robert's condition deteriorating more swiftly than she had anticipated. Perhaps the poison was taking stronger hold, now that his body was weakened. Or perhaps she was misjudging the dosage. Either way, each day he grew more delirious, less aware of time and place. He snapped at courtiers, cursed the gods, and fell into restless sleeps in the middle of the day. Pycelle fretted, though his tonics offered little reprieve. Jaime hovered in the background, occasionally asking after the king's health, but Cersei provided only carefully measured words. Meanwhile, Joffrey strutted through the corridors as though the crown were already his, heedless of the precariousness of the situation. On a sweltering afternoon, the king's retinue forced him to a chair in the throne room, believing that even in his weakened state, he should present himself for an hour of audiences, if only to quell rumors of his impending demise. Robert slumped on the iron throne, sweat rolling down his neck. The metal spikes and swords that composed the seat seemed to dig into his flesh, mocking him. He could barely keep his eyes open, the chamber spinning around him. A parade of minor lords and petitioners approached, bowing, rattling off their pleas or concerns about taxes, bandits, or any number of trivial matters. Robert could scarcely pay attention, though he tried to summon the anger that had once come to him so easily. He gripped the arms of the throne until his knuckles turned white. The flicker of torchlight reflected off his crown, a band of heavy gold that felt like a clamp on his skull. Cersei stood beside him, radiant in a gown of deep burgundy, her expression schooled into that of a worried queen, a woman valiantly supporting her ailing husband. She placed a hand on his shoulder once more, leaning in to murmur what she claimed were clarifications or guidance, but truly, they were naught but appearances for the gathered lords and ladies. At last, Robert could bear it no longer. He rose abruptly, the movement sending a spasm through his chest. He stumbled forward, nearly losing his balance. A collective gasp filled the throne room, and in that moment, a hush fell. The king's guards rushed to steady him, but he shoved them away in a fit of prideful rage. "Enough," he roared, though his voice came out ragged. "I will hear no more of this foolishness. The realm can manage its own damn self for a day." He tore the crown from his head, cast it aside, and staggered out of the throne room. Murmurs flared behind him. Some looked to the queen for reassurance, others merely stared in shocked silence. Cersei followed him at a measured pace, ensuring that her expression conveyed worry rather than triumph. Inside, her pulse pounded with a sense of impending accomplishment and a ripple of unease. This spectacle had revealed just how near Robert might be to a complete collapse. Perhaps it was for the best. If he fell sooner, it would complicate matters with Ned Stark's arrival. But if the timing was right, if Ned arrived just as Robert's health was in a dire state, she could manipulate the situation. She could claim that Robert's last moments had left him too frail to name a regent clearly, or that he had expressed a desire for Joffrey's immediate ascension. There were angles to consider, strategies to employ. Late that night, she slipped into Robert's chambers under the pretense of attending to him in his illness. By the wavering light of a single candle, she gazed upon the King of the Seven Kingdoms, slumped across his bed, half out of his shirt, his face a mask of pain even in sleep. His breath came in ragged wheezes, punctuated by soft groans, as though demons haunted his dreams. The stench of stale sweat and sickness hung in the air. She stepped closer, careful not to disturb him, and for a fleeting instant felt a pang of something akin to pity. Or perhaps it was merely the lingering ghost of memories from when she was a young bride, uncertain of her future. But the moment passed like a shadow before dawn. She reminded herself of all the humiliations, all the scorn, all the insults Robert had heaped upon her through the years. She recalled how he had dismissed her, cheated on her, called her another woman's name in their bed. This was not a man worthy of pity. This was a man who was her obstacle, and now she would remove him for the sake of her children, for the sake of her own power. His hand twitched in his sleep. A small, incoherent mumble escaped his lips. Something about a hunt. Perhaps he dreamed of the forest, of chasing stags through the glades. She almost laughed at the irony. The stag was brought low by a far more cunning predator than he had ever faced in the woods. With a slow, deliberate movement, she drew the small pinch of poison-laced powder from within her sleeve. She glanced around, ensuring no eyes lurked in the shadows, and then she approached the bedside table where a pitcher of water rested. Carefully, she sprinkled the powder into the pitcher, stirring it with a delicate swirl. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. Then she stepped back. In the morning, he would drink from this water, or perhaps in the night if his cough roused him. Either way, another dose would course through his veins. Her hand trembled slightly as she replaced the pitcher's lid. She told herself it was only excitement, only the rush of final victory. Perhaps it was. She stood there for a moment longer, the candlelight playing across her face. Robert stirred again, turning his head, a faint line creasing his brow. She retreated swiftly, pressing herself against the wall, holding her breath. But he did not wake. He sank deeper into the mire of fevered dreams, oblivious to the figure watching him. Steadying herself, Cersei left the room and gently closed the door behind her. In the hallway, a single guard stood watch. A Lannister man. She inclined her head to him, and he said nothing, his gaze darting away. Yes, everything was in place. The king was dying, and no one would be the wiser until it was too late. She returned to her chambers, feeling the cool night breeze through the open windows. She wondered if Ned Stark would sense the shifting tides as soon as he arrived. That honorable wolf might yet prove a thorn in her side. But for now, she savored the knowledge that Robert Baratheon was on the brink of being nothing more than a name spoken in the past tense. Far below, in the underbelly of King's Landing, the city's poorer districts remained oblivious to the intrigues of the castle. Fishermen and whores, bakers and thieves, they went about their nightly routines. The occasional rumor traveled through taverns about the king being ill, but it hardly mattered to them. Few truly grasped the magnitude of what was transpiring. And in one of these grimy taverns, a man with a sly grin whispered to another about hearing that the king's cough echoed through the castle halls at night. That man's words would eventually reach other ears, possibly Varys, possibly someone else's. But it would be too late to change the course of destiny already set in motion. And so it was that the days trickled on, each one leaving Robert weaker, each one tightening Cersei's hold on power. The sun rose and set upon a kingdom ignorant of the precise nature of its king's ailment. Lords and ladies speculated, while Cersei watched from her vantage point, a calculating glimmer in her green eyes. Her father, Tywin Lannister, had always taught her the value of cunning over brute force. This was the proof of it. A single, steady blade of poison cut deeper and more irrevocably than any sword. As Ned Stark's arrival loomed, a hush of anticipation fell over the Red Keep. By then, Robert was pale and drawn, half the man he had once been, eyes sunken in hollow sockets. He did his best to stand tall when necessary, to bark orders to his Kingsguard, to posture as though he was still the victor of the Trident. But every day, he grew more reliant on Pycelle's potions and the sweet relief of respite in his bed. Cersei hovered, maintaining the veneer of a devoted queen, while inwardly, she counted the hours until the final blow fell. On the evening before Ned Stark was set to reach the city, Robert demanded a lavish supper, some shred of his old appetite shining through his illness. The cooks prepared roasted boar, fresh bread, and pitchers of the strongest ale in the cellars. Cersei took that opportunity to slip a larger pinch of poison into his flagon, certain that soon the cumulative effect would be irreversible. She watched him eat with a feverish hunger, tearing into the meat with bare hands, gulping mouthfuls of ale as though they were the only things tethering him to life. And in a twisted sense, perhaps they were. That night, she left him to his drunken slumber, carefully stepping over the scattered plates and bones strewn about the table, the remains of his gluttony. He looked almost peaceful for a moment, lolling in his chair, a bit of ale dribbling down his chin. She reached out and dabbed it away with a cloth, a mockery of tenderness. He did not stir. His breath rasped in his throat, thick with the promise of oblivion. For a long while, she lingered in the shadows of the chamber, listening to the sound of his heartbeat. Yes, it was still strong, the heart of a warrior, but the poison coiled around it like a serpent. It was only a matter of time. She allowed herself one last look at him, remembering the roars of laughter he once unleashed, how they shook the rafters. Now he was nearly silent, save for the whisper of shallow breaths. At last, she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. The corridor stretched out ahead, lit by torches that flickered and danced, and she felt their heat on her face. She did not smile. She did not need to. Everything was in motion. And if the gods themselves were watching, they remained silent, as gods often do when mortals play their games of power and betrayal. Only the shifting wind outside the castle walls, carrying the faint scent of the sea, gave any sign that events were soon to collide, and that the hour of change for the Seven Kingdoms drew ever nearer. Ye no maid, and I did do with her, she were of a bend color. Morning arrived in a hush of golden light, spilling through the high windows of the royal apartments. From the hills beyond the city, sunrise painted the sky in pink and orange, casting a warm glow upon the Red Keep's towers. Yet within King Robert's bedchamber, the world was swathed in gloom. Heavy curtains remained drawn against the dawn, and the candles had long since burned low, leaving only smoldering wicks in their wake. A single servant girl hovered at the door, uncertain whether to enter. Rumor in the corridors said the king had coughed violently all through the night, cursing the gods and demanding more wine. But by the pre-dawn hours, he'd lapsed into fitful silence. Grand Maester Pycelle was already inside, stooped over Robert's bedside, the folds of his long gray robe sweeping the floor. He murmured words of mild reassurance, though his eyes betrayed that he was at a loss. The king's forehead glistened with sweat. One of his arms dangled over the edge of the mattress, hand limp as if drained of all strength. Pycelle straightened slowly, the joints of his spine creaking, and motioned for the servant girl to bring fresh water. She darted across the room, setting a pitcher on the bedside table. Robert stirred at the noise, his eyelids twitching. A faint grunt left his cracked lips. His face was sallow, cheeks sunken, the once robust king scarcely recognizable. At last, he forced his eyes open, glaring around as though the entire world had conspired to disturb him. Pycelle cleared his throat. "Your Grace, I have prepared another draught to ease your breathing. It contains certain healing herbs and a mild sedative to help you rest." Robert's bloodshot gaze flickered over the old man. "I've had enough of your concoctions," he rasped, struggling to sit upright. His voice no longer boomed. It scraped at the air like an old hinge. "Gods! I feel as if my head is stuffed with wool." Pycelle extended a trembling hand, offering a wooden cup filled to the brim with a dark, murky liquid. "Sire, if you do not drink this, your fever may worsen. We only want to see you recovered. Lord Stark arrives today." Robert let out a faint, bitter laugh that turned into a wet cough. The mention of Ned Stark seemed to dredge up a spark of memory. Ned. Right. My old friend. He managed to pull himself forward, bracing against the bedpost. "I'll receive him properly. I won't have him see me like this." The last words caught in his throat, but he forced them out, pride warring with the haze in his eyes. Pycelle bowed his head. "As you will, your grace. But do drink something, even just water. And perhaps an hour of rest before you greet Lord Stark might do you well." He reached to help steady the king's hand as Robert took the pitcher of water. Grimacing, Robert drank, the water dribbling down his chin. It was lukewarm and tasted faintly metallic. He scrunched his face, swallowing the last mouthful. A brief clarity flitted across his features, as though he tasted something amiss. Yet whether from exhaustion or resignation, he said nothing, simply leaned back against the headboard. In the corridor outside, Cersei had been listening. She allowed only a moment's pause before pushing the door open. The servant girl bobbed a quick curtsy and scurried away. Pycelle, sensing the queen's presence, turned and bowed low. Cersei swept inside, the hem of her emerald gown whispering across the floor. Her golden hair was arranged in a neat cascade down her back, soft curls framing her face. She wore a guarded expression, hovering in the space between solicitous wife and queenly authority. She eyed Robert's ragged form, noting the color of his cheeks, pale but mottled with a flush of fever. She saw the pitcher and realized he'd taken more water. Another dose, another step toward the brink. "Leave us," she said to Pycelle, her voice gentle but firm enough that the old man bowed again and shuffled toward the door without protest. Once they were alone, she moved to stand beside the bed. The king's bleary eyes rolled to meet hers. He tried to straighten, but only succeeded in clutching at the covers. His jaw clenched as though he resented her seeing him so frail. "What do you want?" he asked, voice hoarse. She laid a careful hand on the bedpost, not quite touching him. "I came to see how you fared. Word in the castle says your night was difficult." Her tone was cool, measured, yet she kept her face arranged in a mask of concern. Robert spat a half-formed curse. He coughed again, a deep rattling sound that made his chest quake. "I'm not dead yet," he managed between fits. "I'll greet Ned on my feet if it kills me." Cersei tilted her head slightly, letting a faint, rehearsed sigh escape her lips. "You speak as though the entire realm rests on that single gesture. Ned Stark is your friend. He'll understand if you cannot stand." "Damn your pity." Robert's hand shook as he wiped spittle from his mouth. "I won't let him see me broken." She offered a nod, as though conceding the point, then gathered the folds of her gown. "As you wish. I'll have the servants prepare a proper welcome in the throne room. If you need help dressing, or anything, I need no such help." He glared at her, but the fury in his eyes was diminished, like a fire gone to embers. "Go on then. Leave me be." She dipped her head graciously. In truth, she was relieved he told her to go, for the stench of sickness and the sight of him so diminished began to unsettle her nerves. She was not squeamish, not after having borne children, but something about the closeness of his death rattle made her skin crawl. The notion of how near they were to the culmination of her plan set her heart pounding in a strange rhythm. As she left the chamber, she told herself it was excitement, not guilt. In the corridors, the bustle of the castle staff signaled the day's importance. Word had spread that Lord Eddard Stark would arrive by midday, and the entire retinue of the Red Keep was preparing to receive the new hand of the king. Maids rushed about, draping fresh banners along the stone walls, crimson and gold for House Lannister, black and gold for House Baratheon, and the dire wolf of House Stark for the guest of honor. The occasional clang of armor echoed as guards aligned themselves in perfect formation. Horses and carriages were inspected in the courtyard below, stable hands ensuring all was ready for the moment the Stark party appeared at the city gates. Cersei made her way downstairs, where she encountered Petyr Baelish in the hallway leading to the courtyard. He wore a confident smile, his head tilted in a gesture of perpetual amusement. "Your Grace, you seem most composed for a woman whose husband is rumored to be on death's threshold," he observed with a mock bow. She arched an eyebrow, refusing to let his barbed words rattle her. "My husband is merely ill, not dying. Rumors grow wings in King's Landing, Lord Baelish. You, of all people, should know that." She paused, letting the weight of her gaze rest on his sly features. "You seem eager for Lord Stark's arrival. Have you something special planned?" Littlefinger chuckled under his breath. "I wouldn't dare. But you know how important the North is to the stability of the realm. A welcoming presence may do wonders to assure our new hand of the king that King's Landing is a hospitable place." "I'm sure you'll be the perfect host," she said coldly, brushing past him before he could reply. She sensed that he was fishing for signs of distress or desperation, but she would give him nothing. Today was a test, and she intended to pass it with ease. An hour later, the royal procession assembled in the main courtyard to welcome Lord Stark. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of horse sweat. Cersei stood at the forefront, surrounded by the King's Guard. Jaime was there, clad in gleaming white armor, his golden hair shining in the sun. He offered her a brief nod, not a trace of emotion on his sculpted features. Behind them waited an array of courtiers and officials from Varys, who lingered in the back with a serene smile, to Pycelle, who rocked on his heels, clutching a small bag of medicinal herbs as if they were a talisman. For a time, King Robert was nowhere to be seen. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Would he appear in such a weakened state, or remain abed and let the Queen greet Eddard Stark? Murmurs of speculation drifted in the warm breeze. Then, abruptly, a side door creaked open. Robert emerged, leaning heavily on the arm of Sir Barristan Selmy. The crowd parted in silence, astonishment etched on many faces. The king wore his usual finery, dark velvet tunic embroidered with gold stags. But the garment hung looser on him than it had weeks before. His brow was damp, and his cheeks blotched with fever, but he pressed forward nonetheless. The sunlight made him squint, drawing a grimace from him. Cersei stepped forward, schooling her features into a courteous smile. "Your Grace." She greeted him with a slight inclination of her head, ignoring the flicker of disapproval in his eyes. She turned to Jaime and motioned for him to step aside, allowing Robert to take a place at the center of the reception line. The king nodded curtly, though he clung to Barristan's arm for balance. Not long after, a clatter of hooves signaled the approach of the Stark entourage. The gate swung open, revealing a column of riders bearing the Grey Direwolf standard. Leading them was Eddard Stark himself. Tall, reserved, and clad in practical leathers rather than lavish finery. Dust from the long road marred the edges of his cloak. To his right rode his daughters, Sansa and Arya, while a small retinue of northern knights followed behind. Ned's face was set, lines of worry creasing his brow as he guided his horse into the courtyard. At the sight of Robert, his concern deepened. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, handing the reins to a stable hand. The girls followed suit, stumbling a bit on the cobblestones. Ned moved forward, glancing between the king and queen with a faint frown. "Your Grace," he said, bowing deeply. "I came as soon as I received your summons." Robert attempted a grin, though it emerged as a crooked grimace. "My old friend?" he wheezed, and opened his arms as if to embrace Ned. Barristan had to shuffle closer to keep the king upright. Still, Robert insisted on giving Ned a hearty, if unsteady, hug, clapping him on the back. Ned's eyes widened slightly at how thin the king felt beneath his tunic, but he returned the gesture with quiet dignity. "Welcome to King's Landing, Lord Stark," Cersei said, stepping forward with a regal nod. She acknowledged the girls with a thin smile. "We are pleased to have you and your family here." Sansa, wide-eyed and awestruck by the grandeur of the Red Keep, curtsied clumsily. Arya fidgeted, looking about with restless curiosity, her hair in disarray from the journey. Ned offered a stiff smile in return, clearly uneasy. "Your hospitality is appreciated, Your Grace." Robert cleared his throat, trying to summon the bass of his old voice. "We'll have a feast tonight in your honor, Ned," he declared. "And tomorrow we'll get to work on the matters of the realm." He paused to catch his breath, a faint tremor evident in his posture. "For now, you must be tired from the road. Rest, settle in." Ned's gaze traveled over Robert's pallid complexion, the dark circles under his eyes, the labored rise and fall of his chest. "A feast, yes," Ned replied slowly, as though measuring each word. "But only if you're well enough." Robert bristled, as though offended. "I am the king. A little fever won't kill me." Cersei gently touched Robert's sleeve. "We've prepared chambers for the Starks in the Tower of the Hand. Sir Barristan, please escort them to their rooms. Lord Stark, once you and your daughters have settled, the king would be delighted if you join us for a private supper before the formal feast." "Mademoiselle." Ned nodded, though his unease did not wane. He looked ready to protest, but instead he inclined his head and gestured for his daughters to follow Barristan. Sansa cast a timid glance at Joffrey, who stood with a small retinue of court youth, arms folded proudly. Arya shot a quick, fierce look at the assembled crowd before trudging after her sister. The northern party moved off, leading their horses and baggage toward the keep. As soon as they were out of earshot, Robert swayed on his feet. Sir Barristan reached out again, and this time the king did not resist being steadied. Cersei caught the alarm murmurs that ran through the onlookers. She turned, locking eyes with them, silently warning them to keep their tongues. Proudly, she placed a hand on Robert's arm, guiding him back inside. For the moment, he allowed it. The courtyard began to disperse in hushed conversation. They made their way through the castle corridors, Robert dragging his boots with every step. At last, once they were out of sight of the public, he groaned softly, pressing a hand to his chest. Gods, the heat. It's choking me. Cersei pursed her lips. We'll get you back to your chambers, en Pycelle. No, Robert cut in, voice raw but firm. I want to speak with Ned. Alone. Make the arrangements. She studied him, noting the thin sheen of perspiration on his brow, the tightness of his jaw. It was clear he was fading quickly, but the old bullishness still burned in him. Very well, she said quietly. But at least rest for a while. He grunted, giving no direct answer. The king continued to shuffle forward, leaning more heavily on Baratheon than before. Cersei cast a brief glance over her shoulder, meeting Jaime's eyes. He offered a shrug, as if to say there was no defying the king's will. She turned away, her thoughts swirling. If Robert insisted on a private audience with Ned Stark, it might complicate her plans. Yet perhaps it would only confirm his weakness to Ned, who would then be more inclined to handle matters of state and leave her to maneuver behind the scenes. Still, she must be vigilant. Stark was known for his unwavering sense of honor, and that kind of man could be dangerous if he sensed foul play. Once Robert was finally settled behind the doors of his chamber, Cersei left him in Pycelle's care. The old maester mumbled about, preparing a fresh tonic, while Robert sank onto a cushioned seat, sweat soaking through his tunic. She issued instructions for the servants to serve a simple midday meal in Robert's private sitting room, complete with spiced wine and water, both discreetly laced as usual. Then she swept off to handle the reception for Ned and his family, mindful to keep her composure. Down in the Tower of the Hand, Ned Stark entered the set of rooms prepared for him, noting the fresh rushes on the floor, the windows thrown open to let in a breeze from Blackwater Bay. Outside, he caught a glimpse of the city's sprawl. Thousands of cramped buildings and winding streets, smoky fires drifting into the sky. Sansa stood at one of the windows, enthralled by the sight of the Red Keep's gardens below. Arya, on the other hand, looked bored and restless, already complaining about the lack of a suitable place to practice her sword work. Ned thanked Sir Barristan for the escort. The old knight bowed, his expression grave. Lord Stark, if I may speak freely, I am concerned for the king. His illness grows day by day. He insists on ignoring his pain, but I fear it could be more serious than he admits. Ned, recalling the limp hug in the courtyard and the unnatural pallor of Robert's skin, nodded in agreement. I share your worry, Sir Barristan. I'll do what I can to help him, though I'm no maester. He paused, glancing to the corridor beyond. Is the Queen as concerned as well? Barristan's face remained neutral. She is the king's wife and mother of his children. I believe she is concerned in her own way. After a beat he added, but you know how prideful his grace is. He will not easily be persuaded to rest. Ned sighed heavily. Thank you, Sir Barristan. We'll speak again. Once the knight departed, Ned turned to his daughters, trying to mask his apprehension. Settle in, girls. We're guests here, so mind your manners. Sansa, I'll arrange for you to greet the royal family more formally soon. Arya, please try not to get into trouble. Damn child. Arya scowled. Why would I get into trouble? I'm no child. But she said it sullenly, plopping down on a bench. Sansa smoothed her skirts, glancing at her father with a timid smile. The weight of the capital already bore down on them. Ned was about to respond when a soft knock interrupted. A court messenger bowed at the threshold. Lord Stark, the king requests a private audience with you at your earliest convenience. The Queen has arranged a small meal in his private solar. Ned's gaze darkened. Very well, let the king know I'll come at once. The messenger bowed and disappeared. Ned pressed his lips together. Despite the exhaustion from the road, there was no avoiding Robert's summons. The man had been his dear friend, almost a brother. Whatever the cause of this sickness, Ned owed it to him to offer help. He cast one last glance at his daughters, then strode out into the hall, followed by two of his own guards. It was a short walk through the corridors, tapestries fluttering in the faint breeze from the arrow-slit windows. Courtiers and servants alike stepped aside, bowing or curtsying to Lord Stark. Ned noticed the curious stares, heard the whispers. Some pitying, some merely speculative. The king's illness had become the talk of the castle, and Ned realized how precarious the situation could be. If Robert was gravely ill, it would shift the balance of power in ways no one could predict. Upon reaching the king's private solar, Ned was admitted by a pair of Lannister guards. Inside, he found the room heavy with the scent of wine and incense. The windows were half-shuttered, filtering in just enough light to reveal Robert slumped in a broad chair, a thin film of sweat clinging to his brow. A table stood nearby with covered dishes, roasted meats, bread, a small bowl of fruit, and 2 goblets. One was clearly Robert's, half empty already. The other stood untouched. Ned approached cautiously, motioning for his guards to remain at the door. Robert forced a grin, or the closest approximation of one. "Ned," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "Gods, it's good to see your face again." He gestured to a seat. "Come, sit." Ned eased into the chair across from him. He searched Robert's face, seeing the dark hollows beneath his eyes, the shallow rise of his chest. "It's good to see you too, old friend," he said softly. "But I can't lie. You look ill. More than a passing fever." Robert slammed a fist down on the arm of his chair, though it lacked the old force. "I know how I look," he snapped, then coughed, grimacing at the twinge in his side. "I didn't call you here for pleasantries. This realm, it's in need of a strong hand. With Jon Arryn gone." He paused, eyelids flickering as though the memory pained him. "I need you to help keep it all from falling apart." Ned inclined his head. "I promised you once if you ever needed me." "Yes, yes," Robert murmured, waving a shaky hand. "I'm naming you Hand of the King, officially. But gods, I'm not even fit to place the pin on your cloak today." He sagged further into his seat, panting softly. Ned frowned, leaning forward. "Let me fetch Grand Maester Pycelle. You need rest, Robert. You shouldn't be forcing yourself." Robert let out a short bark of laughter that dissolved into more coughing. "Rest? Aye, that's all they tell me to do. The realm can't rest, Ned. If I let go of the reins for a day, the fools on the small council will drive us to ruin. They caw about coin, about their own pockets, about enemies across the sea. I can see straight half the time, but I know well enough that we're walking on a knife's edge." His voice broke, and he squeezed his eyes shut as if in pain. Ned exhaled slowly. "You have my word. I'll do what needs to be done. But you must let Pycelle tend to you. He says your fever is dangerous. If you push yourself..." Robert's eyes snapped open, anger flaring. "Damn that doddering old fool. He's done nothing but pump me full of vile potions that do no good." He took a moment, drawing in a ragged breath. I'm not certain he's telling me all he knows." His gaze flicked around the room, as if wary of being overheard. Ned's brow furrowed. "You suspect something more is at play?" Silence hung between them. Robert stared at the goblet, lifting it shakily to his lips for another long swallow. Ned observed him, noticing the faint tremor in the king's hand. A wave of pity mingled with dread coursed through Ned's heart. He hadn't seen Robert this fragile since they were boys, and even then, Robert had always been the stronger of them. At length, Robert set the goblet down, sloshing wine across the polished wood of the table. "I've had strange dreams," he muttered. "I see shadows in the corridors. Traitors wearing friendly faces. I hear whispers at night. Could be the fever talking, or maybe I'm losing my mind." He raked a hand through his matted hair. "Ned, watch those around you. I trust you, but I can't say the same for half the vipers in this city." "I'm sure." Ned leaned back, his thoughts drifting to the Queen, to Littlefinger, to Varys. All cunning, all capable of secrets. He also thought of the Lannisters' hunger for power. But he kept these thoughts behind a solemn mask. "I will be vigilant," he said quietly. "Is there anyone in particular who's given you reason to suspect?" A flicker of conflict crossed Robert's features. "No names," he said at last, voice cracking. "But I know something isn't right in this damned castle. I can feel it. They all look at me like I'm a dying animal, waiting for the end." "Netrin." Ned didn't answer immediately. In the tense silence, the sound of Robert's labored breathing filled the air. Finally, Ned rose. "Then I'll do what I must, in your name. But promise me you'll take it easy, Robert. I won't be able to focus on the realm if I'm worried. You'll collapse at any moment." Robert mustered a faint grin that brought a shadow of his old self back into his face. "You're as stubborn as ever, Stark." Slowly he inclined his head. "I'll rest. For today. But tonight, we feast. At least a little. Let these wolves and lions see we're still standing together." Then, Ned gently laid a hand on Robert's shoulder. "A short feast. Then, tomorrow, we'll see about making real changes if that's what you wish." Robert nodded, though the simple motion left him looking drained. Without another word, Ned took his leave. At the threshold, he glanced back, seeing Robert sag in the chair, a trembling hand fumbling for his goblet again. The door closed softly, and the two Stark guards fell in behind their lord, silent as the grave. Ned's thoughts churned. He didn't relish the idea that politics in King's Landing might be more complicated than ever, not with his oldest friend teetering on the brink of some mortal sickness. Cersei soon learned of the conversation. She heard from a servant who had hovered near the door that Robert and Ned spoke in hushed, urgent tones. No specifics were gleaned, but she did not need them. She imagined Robert had confirmed Ned's new appointment as Hand. That was as expected. She found herself bristling with a quiet frustration. For Ned Stark to hold that position meant she'd have to be doubly careful. If he noticed any irregularities, Robert's sudden deterioration, the suspicious hints of poison, he would act. Still, she told herself she'd been meticulous. Ned would find nothing if she played her part well. That evening, a subdued gathering took place in the Great Hall. It was not a grand feast by the usual royal standards. Only the main members of the small council, a smattering of high-born guests, and the royal family were present. The hall had been decked in Baratheon and Stark banners, with hints of Lannister red interspersed. Lattice windows were open to let in the cooler night air. Torchlight gleamed upon the polished floors, and the shining armor of the guards stationed around the perimeter. Robert appeared briefly, escorted by two Kingsguard, wearing a heavy cloak over his shoulders as though he felt a chill. He took his seat at the head of the table, with Ned to his right and Cersei to his left. Sansa, Arya, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen sat further down. Servants bustled about, setting plates of roasted duck, fresh loaves of bread, and flagons of wine. Robert tore into his meal with forced gusto, sweat beading at his temples despite the cool evening. He drank several cups of wine, occasionally letting out a gruff laugh whenever one of the lords recounted a light-hearted story. But anyone paying close attention could see the strain etched into every line of his face. Midway through the meal, Ned glanced around the table, noting the watchful presence of the Queen, the calculating eyes of Littlefinger, and the disquieting serenity of Varys. Each had their own secrets. Each regarded Robert's ill condition with varying degrees of concern, or, in some cases, poorly disguised opportunism. When Robert declared he was weary and rose to leave, Ned offered to accompany him, but the king waved him off and stumbled out on his own. Cersei excused herself, gliding after him like a silent wraith. Ned remained behind, though he found little appetite for food. Sansa's eyes followed Joffrey's every move, while Arya poked at her meal, clearly bored by the subdued feast. Across from him, Petyr Baelish flashed a polite smile. "Lord Stark, how are you finding our fair city so far?" Ned regarded him impassively. "It's bigger than I remember, and hotter." Littlefinger's smirk deepened. "One of the many charms of King's Landing, my lord. I'm sure you'll find the climate invigorating once you get used to it." Ned did not return the smile. "I'm sure." He turned back to his plate, unwilling to be drawn into a game of witty banter. Deep in his mind, he wondered if Robert's fever was entirely natural. Yet he had no proof, no reason beyond a nagging sense that something was off. He resolved to keep watch, to scrutinize the daily routines around the king, and to remain alert to any clue that might surface. Later that night, in the dim lantern light of the corridors, Cersei caught up to Robert as he trudged toward his chambers. The king's breath rattled audibly. She wondered, fleetingly, if she had hastened his decline too sharply. If he died too soon, Ned Stark might suspect foul play, particularly if the Northmen discovered any unusual substances in his blood. For a moment, she contemplated easing off the poison, let it run its course more slowly. But she feared giving him time to recover, or to glean the truth. "Let me help you, Robert," she offered, stepping forward to support his arm. He glowered at her but did not shake her off. Together, they walked the last few yards to the door, the king nearly leaning his full weight upon her slender frame. Inside, Robert sank onto the bed with a strangled groan, pressing a hand to his chest. "I'm burning," he mumbled. "Why is it so hot in here?" Cersei motioned to a waiting servant to open the windows wide. Night air drifted in, cool enough to stir the curtains. She poured a cup of water from the pitcher, swirling it to ensure the powder was well dissolved, then brought it to his lips. He drank, though his eyes flickered with a faint suspicion. She managed a reassuring smile. "It's just water," she said softly. "You need to stay hydrated." He drained the cup, and a tense silence followed. Once he had finished, Robert fell back against the pillows, eyes sliding shut. Cersei waited, listening to the slow, ragged draw of his breath. He murmured something unintelligible. She peered closer, but the words were lost to delirium. Stepping away, she waved the servant out, leaving only one guard at the door. Gazing down upon the king, she was struck by the memory of the day he rode victoriously into the capital. Years ago, draped in shining armor, the city cheering his name. How the once mighty had fallen. She felt no triumph in this moment, merely a grim sense of duty to her own cause. With careful fingers, she brushed his sweat-damp hair from his brow, and marveled at how unrecognizable he had become. Each passing day brought them closer to the inevitable end, and a realm without Robert Baratheon upon the throne. At the same time, Ned Stark had returned to his temporary quarters, ushering his daughters to their beds. Sansa drifted off dreaming of courtly romance. Arya, restless, only feigned sleep before she slipped out in search of secret passages or quiet courtyards to explore. Ned, consumed by worry, stood at the window overlooking the city. Torchlights glimmered in the labyrinth of streets below, and a waxing moon illuminated the harbor. He remembered a younger Robert, brimming with laughter and life. The man he'd seen tonight was a shadow, ravaged by sickness, or something more insidious. Ned could not banish that thought from his mind. He resolved to pay a visit to Grand Maester Pycelle in the morning, perhaps seek another opinion on Robert's health. If that yielded nothing, he might even speak with the Master of Whisperers, though he distrusted Varys' motives. Above all, Ned wished to find the truth. It was his solemn duty to protect the king, no matter how dire the situation might seem. Elsewhere in the keep, hidden within his spiderweb of informants, Varys wrote small notes by candlelight, sending messages with his little birds. The news of the king's failing health could have far-reaching consequences, and Varys' job was to ensure he always knew which way the winds were blowing. If Robert died, chaos could tear the realm apart, unless a proper succession was firmly established. And Varys preferred stability, for chaos, while it could be a ladder to some, often led to unpredictable ends. As the castle settled into uneasy slumber, the only sounds were distant footfalls of guards, and the occasional echo of owls calling outside. In Robert's chamber, Cersei finally withdrew to her own rooms, leaving Pycelle to hover with a worried expression. The old maester busied himself checking the king's pulse, wiping his brow, and occasionally administering pungent herbs. Cersei walked away from the scene, letting the door close behind her, feeling that subtle thrill of control even as a sliver of dread needled at her gut. She was too far in to turn back now. That night, Robert dreamed of a battlefield. In his vision, he stood knee-deep in mud, warhammer in hand, thunder rolling overhead. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, ghostly foes, swirling clouds of steel and smoke. He swung wildly, heart pounding, only to realize there was no tangible enemy, just illusions born of fear and fever. He fell to his knees in the mud, a metallic taste filling his mouth. Across the hazy mire, he thought he saw a golden lion watching him from a hill, its eyes gleaming before the dream dissolved into blackness. When dawn broke, He awoke gasping for air, the pain in his chest sharper than before. He struggled upright, calling for Pycelle. The maester rushed in, helped him sip another tonic. Robert cursed, feeling no relief from the bitter liquid. He stared at the old man, eyes wild. "Tell me what's wrong with me," he demanded, voice quavering. "Stop with your damned, it's just a fever. Why haven't I improved?" Pycelle wrung his hands, half bowing. "Your Grace, I have tried every remedy I know. You have symptoms of an illness that, well, it's unlike the typical fevers we see in the capital. Your sweating is excessive. There is a dryness in your throat that resists healing. Your cough is deep, as if your lungs are—" "Spare me," Robert growled, chest rising in heavy spurts. "Why am I not better?" Pycelle met his gaze, the lines of his face sagging. "I cannot say. It could be a malady wrought by the climate, or something you ate. You've put great strain on your body over the years, my king. Your constitution may—" Robert seized Pycelle's robe, pulling the old man close with surprising strength. "Find a cure," he hissed. "I won't die like some rat in a gutter." "Do you hear me?" Pycelle's eyes darted with alarm. "I will do all in my power, your grace." Robert let go, and the maester nearly stumbled backward. The king sank back against the pillows, panting, face contorted with rage and pain. Outside the windows, the city stirred, people going about their business, oblivious to the king's mortal struggle. Pycelle dabbed at his brow with a handkerchief, trembling from the encounter. He thought to himself that this was no ordinary sickness. Some secret agent or cunning scheme could be at work. Yet to suggest such a thing might cost him his position, if not his head, especially if he pointed to the wrong culprit. Shortly after, Ned Stark arrived, knocking lightly before entering. He found Robert hunched in bed, chest heaving, eyes bloodshot. Pycelle lingered nearby like a fretting mother hen. Ned stepped forward, dismissing Pycelle with a courteous nod so he could speak to Robert alone. The old maester bowed out, scurrying to gather more herbs or a fresh tonic. Ned lowered himself into a chair beside the bed. "Robert," he began softly, "you look worse today than yesterday. I can't stand by and watch you suffer." "Dad in me?" Robert spat onto the floor in anger. "I'll not have you coddle me, Ned. I've told Pycelle to keep trying. If the gods are just, this curse will lift." His voice cracked, revealing the undercurrent of fear beneath his bravado. Ned placed a hand on his friend's forearm. "Let me help. If there's anything unnatural about this illness, we'll root it out. You have my word." Robert's eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting someone to listen. Then he leaned closer, his breath hot against Ned's ear. "Watch them," he whispered, a faint tremor in his voice. "All of them. I've asked questions, but no one gives me a straight answer." His fingers dug into Ned's wrist. "The Queen, she's been too calm. Though I can't say how or why, I feel something." Ned's brow creased. "You suspect she might—" But Robert shook his head, wincing at the motion. "I don't know what I suspect. She's a lion, though, and lions are cunning. Just watch her, Ned. If you see anything that suggests—" He coughed, cutting the sentence short. For a moment, he looked so frail that Ned feared he would die right then and there. At last, Robert calmed, wiping the spittle from his mouth. "If I should fall, Ned, you protect my children. Even Joffrey." He grimaced as he said his son's name, some unspoken conflict flickering in his eyes. "Promise me." Ned's heart twisted. "I promise," he said firmly, placing his other hand over Robert's. "But you're not going anywhere yet. We'll find answers." A soft shuffle of footsteps made Ned turn. Cersei stood in the doorway, her arms folded neatly, face a perfect mask of concern. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, voice quiet. Ned released Robert's hand, standing at once. "It's fine," Robert croaked, though he glared at her. "Ned was just checking on me." Cersei drifted forward, casting a fleeting glance at Ned. "Pycelle needs a word with you, my lord," she said. "He's waiting in the corridor." Ned inclined his head, reluctant to leave Robert's side. But the king gave a curt nod, And so Ned moved past Cersei. As he went, he felt her eyes on him, as though evaluating his every step. In the hallway, Pycelle indeed stood waiting, a nervous expression on his ancient face. Ned was about to question the maester about Robert's condition, when he heard the king's harsh whisper from within the room, the low murmur of Cersei's voice in response. The thick door muffled the words, leaving only the tension to seep through the crack. Pycelle cleared his throat. "Lord Stark," he said, bowing slightly, "I wanted to ask if you might help persuade His Grace to try a new remedy I have prepared. It includes some rarer substances from Essos, said to be effective against fevers of an unknown nature. The king, however, refuses anything that has a strong odor or taste." "Dean." Ned crossed his arms, mind still reeling from Robert's plea. "I'll speak to him," he replied. "But I need you to be frank, Maester. Is Robert dying?" Pycelle's eyes widened at the blunt question, and he glanced around to ensure no one else listened. "The king's condition is dire, my lord. I cannot say for certain that he is dying, but he does not improve. If anything, he worsens, his failing." Ned's mouth pressed into a grim line. "Then we must take every precaution. Have the king's food and drink tested before it reaches him." Pycelle looked alarmed. "Lord Stark, do you truly believe?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Ned said firmly. "But I won't risk it. From now on, see to it that everything brought to the king is tasted and verified. If anyone objects, they answer to me." Pycelle bobbed his head in frantic agreement. "As you say, my lord." He clutched at his chain of office. "But the Queen will understand," Ned finished, voice taking on a steely edge. "For the king's safety." Inside the chamber, once Ned had gone, Cersei approached Robert with carefully measured steps. He watched her warily. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, the air thick with unspoken enmity. At last, she perched on the edge of a stool near the bed. "Robert," she began, voice low, "you should listen to Pycelle." He ran a tongue over his cracked lips, eyes flicking to a goblet on the bedside table, empty now. "I'll consider it," he said gruffly. "You and your father's lackeys, you want to keep me drugged. Is that it?" She smiled thinly. "We want you well, my king. That's all." He scoffed, though the sound ended in a hacking cough. "You've never wanted me well, Cersei. You've always wanted me gone." The words hung in the air, raw and accusatory. She tilted her head, letting out a tiny sigh. "You believe that if you wish, I won't argue with a delirious man." He tried to push himself upright, but his body failed him, leaving him slumped and panting. Rage flared in his eyes. "If I learn you had any part in this," he hissed, "I'll see you hang." Her heart pounded at the threat, but she forced a gentle smile. "You speak as though I'd poison my own husband, the father of my children. Robert, do you truly believe me that monstrous?" He glared at her in silence, refusing to confirm or deny. She met his gaze, unwavering. After a moment, she stood, adjusting the folds of her gown. "Get your rest," she said calmly. "You'll need your strength." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked out, her composure unbroken. Once the door closed behind her, though, she felt a brief tremor ripple through her. It was one thing to watch him wither in ignorance. It was another to see suspicion lurking in his fevered eyes. Yet she still held all the cards. He was too weak to act, too uncertain. Let him suspect. By the time he found the will or the means to prove anything, it would be too late. The next few days passed in a grim haze. Robert's condition showed no improvement despite Pycelle's new concoctions. Even the testers who sampled his meals and drinks fell ill to nothing, confirming to Ned that poison might not be so easily traced, or that it had come at an earlier point. The king spent hours locked in fever dreams, occasionally rousing to bark orders at Ned, or to berate Pycelle. Meanwhile, Ned settled into his role as Hand, wrestling with the many demands of the realm. Complaints from the Riverlands about brigands, concerns about the crown's debts, and urgent letters from the wall speaking of wildling raids. He had no time to search for conspiracies. Yet the disquiet lingered at the back of his mind like a shadow. Cersei continued her well-rehearsed dance, taking care to administer the poison in smaller doses. Mindful of Ned's order that the king's meals be tested, she adapted, slipping the powder into Robert's personal pitcher or goblet when no eyes were upon her, or late at night when he demanded water to quench his incessant thirst. A grain here, a grain there, enough to ensure he would not recover, but not enough to raise immediate alarms in any tester's sampling of the main kitchen's offerings. She watched Ned's movements carefully, prepared to counter any sign that he might be closing in on the truth. Yet it seemed his honor bound him to trust the official channels. Pycelle's diagnoses, the idea that Robert's body was merely succumbing to years of abuse. She recognized his reluctance to see deception where it might exist. That was her shield against him. Day by day, Robert coughed harder, slept more fitfully, and ate less. His towering frame shrank. There were times when he could barely rise from bed, cursing like a wounded beast. Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella were kept away, so as not to witness their father's decline. Ned Stark sought audiences with him on matters of state, only to find the king either asleep or too delirious to offer coherent counsel. The small council, helmed by Cersei's presence, took charge, issuing decrees in Robert's name, while the realm whispered that the king might soon pass from this world. And in the dark corners of the Red Keep, each faction waited. Some eyed Joffrey as the heir, though they questioned his mettle. Others wondered if Stannis Baratheon, Robert's brother, might claim the throne if Robert died without a clear directive. Or even Renly, the more charismatic younger brother. Varys listened. Littlefinger smiled. Cersei calculated. Ned worried. All the while, Robert Baratheon, once the mighty warrior who claimed the Iron Throne by force, slipped further into the clutches of an unseen assassin, a quiet poison that gnawed at him from within. And thus, the seeds of turmoil were sown throughout the realm, setting the stage for conflicts yet to erupt, even as the king's heartbeat grew fainter with each passing day. Ned Stark stood alone in one of the Red Keep's lesser-known courtyards, a small enclosed space draped with ivy and the sweet scent of orange blossoms. Dawn's early light had not yet fully reached the high battlements, so the yard lay in dim haze, echoing only the soft drip of a nearby fountain. He had come here to gather his thoughts, away from watchful eyes. Sleep had eluded him for the better part of the night. Each time he closed his eyes, images of Robert's gaunt face intruded, mingling with half-remembered scenes of their youth. The robust friend he once knew. He pressed a hand to the cool stone of the wall. The day's first breeze ruffled his hair, carrying with it a hint of the city's salt air. He wondered if Robert was awake yet, or still locked in that nightmare of pain and delirium. An insistent voice in the back of Ned's mind whispered that something was off, that perhaps the king's condition was not a simple matter of overindulgence and lingering fevers. He recalled that fleeting look of suspicion in Robert's eyes. How the king had warned him to trust no one in the court. But what was he to do with such vague misgivings? Accuse the queen openly? He had no proof, only an undercurrent of disquiet that would not let him be. He startled at the sound of footsteps on gravel. Turning, he saw Petyr Baelish approaching with a casual half-smile, hands folded behind his back. Ned stiffened. Littlefinger had an uncanny knack for appearing at inconvenient moments. He was dressed in a modest doublet of dark green brocade, the mockingbird pin at his collar glinting in the pale light. "My Lord Stark," Littlefinger said with a bow, though his tone was one of mild amusement. "You're out early." Ned regarded him coolly. "I might say the same of you, Lord Baelish. Are you in the habit of strolling the castle at dawn?" Littlefinger's lips curved. "On occasion. I find this time of day refreshing, free of noise and interruptions. One can see clearly what the day might hold." His gaze flickered over Ned, as though reading the tension in his shoulders. "You look troubled." "I have much to think on," Ned replied tersely, unwilling to confide anything to the master of coin. "As do we all," said Littlefinger. He drew closer, lowering his voice. "The king's condition has many of us worried. There are whispers about the succession, concerns about new alliances. You must realize that your presence here is a stabilizing influence, an honorable man from the north, a close friend of his grace." Ned exhaled slowly. I'm not looking for power, if that's your implication. I only want to see Robert recover. Littlefinger tilted his head. Of course. But if the gods forbid it, and he does not recover, the realm will be thrust into a delicate situation. It might be best to consider contingencies before we're forced to scramble. Ned's brow furrowed. I will not speak of Robert's death as though it's a certainty. A faint sigh escaped Littlefinger. You are an idealist, my lord. The city is full of pragmatists, each with their own angle. But if you ever wish to discuss practical matters, you know where to find me. With that, he pivoted gracefully and made his way back down the narrow path, disappearing around the corner of the colonnade. Ned stood there a moment longer, jaw clenched. The man's veiled insinuations only heightened his unease. He resolved to see Robert immediately, to gauge for himself how far the fever had progressed. Pushing away from the wall, he strode out of the courtyard and into the castle's corridors, ignoring the occasional bows from guards and passing courtiers. The torch brackets on the walls were still lit, their flames flickering against the encroaching daylight. By the time he reached the door to Robert's bedchamber, Grand Maester Pycelle was shuffling out with an air of solemnity, wringing his hands. "My lord hand," Pycelle greeted, bending at the waist. "The king has awakened, but he's in a foul mood and feverish still. I fear." "I'll see him," Ned said curtly, brushing past the maester. Inside, he found Robert propped up on pillows, eyes half-lidded, hair damp with sweat. A half-eaten meal lay on a tray nearby. A few chunks of bread, congealed gravy, a portion of roast goat that had barely been touched. Robert glanced up, scowling. "Ned, come to pester me like the rest of them." His voice sounded hollow, as though he'd spent the night shouting. He reached for a cup, presumably water, and took a long gulp. A tremor ran through his arm, causing droplets to spill down his chin. Ned stepped forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to pester you, Robert, but you're clearly no better." Robert tried to straighten, his pride bristling. "What is this, a lecture? I've enough of Pycelle's mewling. He says I must stay abed, and that damned old fool keeps brewing potions that taste of dung. Yet the fever remains." He coughed, a deep rattle that sent a shiver through Ned's spine. Ned took a seat at the bedside. "Let me send for better healers, then, ones from beyond the city or across the sea. We cannot simply—" Robert's hand banged against the mattress. "Enough. You think I've lost the ability to rule? You think I should be replaced by the time some Cersei scholar sails here with new herbs? I'll not linger in bed waiting for strangers to poke and prod me. I'm Robert Baratheon, for the gods' sakes." His voice was passionate, though it cracked on the last word. He pressed a fist to his mouth, fighting another bout of coughing. Ned rested a palm on his friend's arm. He felt the tremor beneath Robert's skin, the heat radiating like a furnace. "Robert," he said quietly, "I know you don't want to appear weak, but you are ill, and if there's any treachery in it, we need to root it out." Robert's gaze flickered with a haunted look. He swallowed hard. "I vive," had the same thought. But who would stand to gain from such a thing? If I die, the Lannisters keep the throne through Joffrey. Unless Stannis. He broke off, breathing heavily, as if the very notion of his own death left him disoriented. Ned felt a twist in his gut. "You mentioned you were suspicious of the Queen." "I am," Robert rasped, rage shining in his eyes. "But suspicion is not proof, and I've none. If I accuse her openly, and it's a fever dream, the realm tears itself in half. She has powerful allies. My father-in-law is no small threat. So I do nothing, waiting to see which day might be my last." Then, a pall of silence settled over them. Ned shifted, uncertain. He thought of Cersei's cool demeanor, the way she hovered near Robert, but never once showed genuine distress. Could she truly be capable of poisoning him day by day? If so, how to prove it without unleashing chaos? Ned was no spy master. He loathed subterfuge, the thought of rummaging through kitchens and personal belongings. Yet to ignore Robert's suspicion might be a fatal error. Before he could speak again, Robert gasped, clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Ned leapt forward, calling for a servant. When Pycelle rushed back in, Robert waved him off, hissing through clenched teeth as he fought to breathe. The moment passed, leaving the king trembling. Pycelle hovered, uncertain whether to approach. Finally, Ned lifted a goblet of water from the tray, pressing it to Robert's lips. The king drank, eyes watery with either rage or fear or both. When he sank back, his entire body sagged, as if even that small exertion had robbed him of what little strength remained. Ned stood. "Rest," he said, voice hoarse with sympathy. "I'll see to it that the council handles urgent matters. Conserve your strength, Robert." A slow exhalation left the king's lips. He closed his eyes, either unwilling or unable to reply. Pycelle edged closer, fussing with a cloth to dab at Robert's brow. With one last, solemn glance at the king, Ned stepped out into the corridor, his pulse pounding. If events continued this way, Robert wouldn't last another moon. Perhaps not even a fortnight. Ned found that thought terrifying. Like a child discovering a beloved older brother was mortal after all. He walked the halls in a daze until he came upon Sir Barristan Selmy, stationed in an alcove near a gallery of ancient statues. Barristan bowed his head respectfully. "Lord Stark," he greeted in his soft, unassuming voice. Ned returned a nod. "Sir Barristan, you've known the king longer than most. Do you believe this is a natural illness?" Barristan hesitated. His weathered face revealed the weight of too many years in service. "I am no maester," he began carefully. "But I fought beside Robert in the rebellion. I watched him endure wounds that would fell lesser men. This sickness is unlike anything I've seen him face. And I've seen..." Small changes in the castle's routine that seem odd, though I cannot say they're connected. Memoir said. Ned studied the knight's face. "What changes?" Barristan took a breath, gaze flicking around to ensure no one stood too close. "In the last few weeks, servants were reassigned without explanation, particularly those who tend the king's apartments or serve him meals. New faces, sworn to the queen's household. It might be nothing, but I find it peculiar." Ned's stomach clenched. The notion that Cersei, or someone loyal to her, might have planted Confederates in Robert's chambers only stoked his worst fears. "Thank you for telling me. I'll be cautious. And if you learn anything else, anything at all, come to me at once." Barristan inclined his head, relief evident in his eyes, as though he had longed to confide in someone. "I shall. I wish only for the king's health and the realm's peace." Ned put a hand on the knight's shoulder. "As do I." They parted, each carrying a burden of uncertainty. For Ned, the day's responsibilities loomed. Robert might be in bed, but petitions still flooded in from the lords of the realm, and the small council convened daily. If Ned did not keep up appearances, suspicion would swirl around him too. When he arrived at the council chamber, he found Varys, Littlefinger, and Renly Baratheon, already engaged in low conversation. Renly stood near a tall window, arms folded across his chest. Of Robert's younger brothers, Renly was the charismatic one, handsome and quick-witted. He wore a richly dyed doublet of green and gold, a stag pin at his collar. His stance and the faint tremor in his voice betrayed that he was not unaffected by Robert's decline. Indeed, Ned suspected he was the only Baratheon sibling to have visited Robert recently, for Stannis was away at Dragonstone and had not responded to the ravens about Robert's illness. As Ned entered, Renly broke off his conversation with Littlefinger. "Lord Stark," he greeted, forcing a tight smile. "Any news from my brother this morning?" Ned took his seat, glancing around at the others. "He is awake, but still quite ill. We must carry on his duties in his absence." Varys offered a sympathetic nod, his hands folded in front of his voluminous robes. "It is a difficult time for the realm. We can only hope the king recovers soon. The city grows uneasy." Renly drummed his fingers on the windowsill. "Uneasy is an understatement. I've heard lords mutter that if Robert fails to appear in public soon, rumors might start that he's dead already, and the crown tries to hide it." Ned frowned. "Then we must be transparent to a point. Perhaps a brief audience, if he's strong enough, so the people can see he lives." Hello. Littlefinger tapped his chin. That could quell some murmurs. But if the king's appearance is too compromised, it might stir the wrong kind of fear. A short glimpse might suffice. Then we can claim he must rest again. He shrugged lightly, as if discussing a minor detail of city finances. Renly shifted his weight. I don't like the subterfuge, but if it comforts the masses, it may be worth a try. Ned eyed the master of coin, annoyance pricking at him. The king's health is not a stage performance, Lord Baelish. We should do what truly benefits him, not simply put him on display. Littlefinger spread his hands. Oh, of course, my lord. I only suggest that in times of uncertainty, illusions can be a mercy. Ned bit back a retort. He turned to Varys. Have your little birds heard anything of foreign origin? Any poisons or illnesses rumored to be spreading? Varys's soft face creased with concern. I have my whispers, Lord Stark. There is talk of new potions from the east that cause lingering fevers, slow-acting toxins used by the faceless men or the sorrowful men. But I have no direct evidence that such substances have entered the Red Keep. Should I delve deeper? Mandaril. Ned hesitated, aware that once Varys truly began digging, secrets would not remain secrets for long. But if Robert was indeed being poisoned, they had no choice. Yes, quietly though. If you find any lead on such toxins, bring it to me before you act. Varys inclined his head. As you wish, my Lord Hand. The meeting trudged onward, addressing mundane matters, provisioning the city guard, handling a minor dispute among lesser lords. Yet beneath each exchange, Ned felt the tension roiling. Renly's foot tapped restlessly on the floor. Littlefinger's smirk hovered at the edges of conversation. Varys looked entirely serene, which Ned knew was a front. When at last the council dispersed, Ned was left with a stack of parchments, obligations he could scarcely focus on while Robert's life hung in the balance. He left the chamber, mind whirling, and nearly collided with Arya in a narrow hallway. His younger daughter had clearly been wandering off her usual paths. She clutched a wooden practice sword, her hair disheveled. "Father!" she exclaimed, eyes bright with curiosity. "I was looking for a place to practice." Ned suppressed a groan. "Arya, we've spoken about this. King's Landing is not Winterfell. You can't roam freely without a guard." She scrunched her nose. "It's stuffy inside our rooms, and Sansa's always prattling about Joffrey or some court nonsense. I need fresh air." "Oh no." He glanced around, ensuring they were relatively alone. "Very well. I'll find Syrio Forel and have him arrange something more appropriate. But promise me you won't wander near the king's apartments." Arya's eyes flickered. "The king's apartments? Why would I go there?" She caught the hint of worry in Ned's voice. "Is he really that sick?" Sansa said she heard a servant say he might die. Ned laid a hand gently on her shoulder. "He's very ill, yes. That's why we mustn't disturb him." Arya gazed up at him, uncharacteristically subdued. "Robert's your friend?" Ned nodded. "He is, or at least he was, for many years. Now, run along and stay out of trouble. I'll see you at supper." Arya gave a small nod, turned, and dashed off down the corridor, ponytail bouncing. Ned watched her go, a bittersweet ache in his chest. Arya's directness reminded him how simple life had been in the north, where intrigue was rare and loyalties clear. Here, even a child could sense the danger coiled beneath the Red Keep's polished floors. That evening, Pycelle attempted to coax Robert into a short walk in the courtyard, the better to air his lungs. Cersei hovered nearby, wearing a gown of deep red velvet, her expression carefully arranged into wifely concern. Ned arrived just in time to witness Robert's half-hearted attempt to stand. The king's legs quivered as he rose from the edge of the bed, Barristan on one side, Pycelle on the other. He took 2 steps, breathing in ragged gulps, then sagged, forcing them to catch him before he fell. "Damn this!" he spat through clenched teeth, face twisted with shame. "I can't even stand upright. How am I to rule?" Barristan murmured gentle words of encouragement, but Robert's temper ignited. He shoved Barristan's arm aside, though the effort made him stumble. Pycelle flustered, arms flailing. but managed to steady the king. Cersei, lips pressed thin, stood by, not stepping forward to help. Ned moved swiftly, placing a firm hand under Robert's elbow. "Robert," Ned said softly, "no one doubts your strength. But you must recover first. Pushing yourself could worsen things." Robert glared, mouth tightening. "I don't need a child's pity, Ned." Yet he allowed himself to be guided back onto the bed. He breathed heavily, chest heaving. "What I need is a cure." Cersei, voice low, said, "Grand Maester, you claim to have tried everything. Are we certain we're not dealing with a more exotic malady?" Ned watched the interplay closely, suspecting the queen was feigning ignorance. Pycelle stiffened, stroking his long white beard. "Your Grace, there are indeed rare illnesses, but for them to appear here, in the capital, at this time, would be beyond coincidence." Cersei let her gaze fall on Ned. "Perhaps Lord Stark is correct. We should bring in a foreign healer, or consult more widely. If the king is so gravely ill, we must explore every avenue." "Power." Robert's eyes pinned her with a hard stare. "Would you prefer I fill the castle with strangers? You've enough control of what goes on here already." His words dripped with bitterness, cutting through the polite facade. Cersei's face remained impassive, though a flicker of annoyance passed across her features. Ned cleared his throat. "For the king's benefit, perhaps it's wise to consider all possibilities. I'll write to the Citadel tonight, requesting additional insight from the Archmaesters. With your permission, Robert." A low grunt came from the king. He seemed too exhausted to argue further. "Do what you want, Ned," he muttered, turning his face away. Cersei arched a brow, then gave a short nod. "I think that would be best." She stepped closer, offering Robert a cup of water. He stared at it as though it were poison, then took it with a shaking hand and drank. Ned lingered only a few more moments before excusing himself, heart heavy. If the queen was indeed behind this, she was playing a masterful game, pretending concern, encouraging outside aid that might never arrive in time. Yet if she was innocent, Ned risked slandering her for no reason. The lines had never seemed so blurred. Night fell, thick and humid. The sky over King's Landing smeared with clouds that threatened a storm. Ned retreated to his chambers, penned a missive to the Citadel, and dispatched a raven with urgency. Afterward, he joined his daughters briefly for supper. Sansa chattered about the court gossip, how some ladies had commented on the king's condition, while Arya asked if there were any secret passages in the Red Keep that led to the outside. Ned gave only absent responses, his mind too tangled to engage fully. A tap at his door some hours later startled him from his thoughts. Jory Castle, his most trusted guardsman, entered with a solemn nod. "My lord, there is a steward outside. Says the queen requests your presence in the king's solar." Ned rose at once. "The hour is late. Has something happened?" Jory shrugged. "He only said it was urgent, that the king was awake and wished to see you." "Blarman." Ned swallowed hard. "Very well. Let's go." He followed Jory through winding corridors lit by torches whose flames danced in the swirling drafts. Servants scurried about, preparing for an unexpected audience with the king. When they reached the solar, the Lannister guards at the door stepped aside. Inside, Robert sat by a small table near the window, shoulders hunched. Cersei stood behind him, hands folded at her waist, the flicker of torchlight catching in her blonde hair. Robert's breathing came in labored puffs, but his eyes glowed with a grim resolve. As Ned entered, the king beckoned him closer with an unsteady gesture. "Close the door," Robert commanded. Jory lingered in the hall while Ned shut the door. Cersei's gaze swept over Ned like a hawk, unreadable. The room was thick with tension, the smell of spiced wine lingering in the air. On the table lay a map of the 7 kingdoms, corners weighted down by small figurines shaped like stags. Robert tapped a shaky finger on the map. "I summoned you because I've made a decision. About the realm and about who shall oversee it if..." His voice caught. He forced himself onward. "If the gods see fit to take me from this world sooner than I'd like." Cersei's face remained a perfect mask. Ned sensed she already knew of Robert's plan but was letting him speak. He moved closer to the table, heart hammering in his chest. "Go on, Robert, Dotikai." The king swallowed, sweat beading on his forehead. "I want it in writing. You'll draft the document, Ned. State that if I fall, Eddard Stark shall serve as regent and protector of the realm until Joffrey comes of age." "I know." Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Ned felt a surge of conflicting emotions: honor at being chosen, dread at the burden, and a creeping suspicion that Robert was placing him at direct odds with the Queen if she intended to secure power for herself. "Robert," Ned began carefully, "this is a grave matter." "Are you sure?" "You're the only one I trust," Robert cut in, voice tight. "The only one who won't twist the realm to his own advantage. Even my own brothers have ambitions, but not you. So write it down, seal it with the royal seal, and let all see it's my will." "No, I need." Cersei stepped forward, resting a hand lightly on Robert's shoulder. "If that's what you want, my king, I shall not stand in your way, but perhaps it's premature. You'll recover, and all this talk of regents." Robert glared at her, fury and fear mingling. "I'll do it now, not later. Ned, fetch parchment and quill." Ned hesitated only a moment before moving to the king's desk. He found a blank sheet of fine vellum, an inkwell, and a quill. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote out the king's words, substituting "my son Joffrey" where Robert said only Joffrey, though a pang of conscience made him want to write "my heir" instead. The suspicion of Joffrey's parentage had never been far from Ned's thoughts. But he could not raise that question now, not while Robert hovered on the brink. Once the statement was written, Ned held it out for Robert. With trembling hands, Robert signed his name. He then pressed the royal seal onto a glob of warm wax, fixing it with a shaky push of his thumb. When he lifted his head, his eyes brimmed with exhaustion. "There," he croaked. "Done." Cersei leaned in to examine the document. Her lashes lowered, hiding whatever emotion passed across her face. "And so it shall be," she said softly, stepping back. Robert turned to Ned. "Keep it safe. Let no one speak against it, or you do what you must. Swear to me." Ned set the parchment aside for a moment, taking Robert's clammy hand. "I swear," he said. The king's grip felt weak, but Ned squeezed gently, hoping to offer some semblance of comfort. A violent cough seized Robert then, bending him nearly double. Ned darted forward, alarmed. Cersei reflexively moved as well, but Robert jerked away from her touch. The coughing fit lasted what felt like an eternity before he finally drew in a ragged breath and slumped back in his chair, eyes fluttering. Cersei brushed aside a strand of hair and turned to Ned. "He needs rest. Let me see him to bed," she said, voice devoid of warmth. Ned nodded stiffly, folding the parchment and tucking it inside his doublet. "I'll leave you then." Robert muttered something, but the words were incoherent. Sweat rolled down his cheeks. Cersei looped an arm under his, helping him to stand. Her face remained eerily composed, though a faint tightness showed in her jaw. Ned wondered what thoughts churned behind those green eyes. Without further words, he slipped from the room. Jory waited outside, eyebrows raised in question. Ned only shook his head. Together, they made their way back to Ned's chambers, flanked by the occasional torch. Once inside, Ned locked the door and carefully retrieved the parchment, unrolling it to reread Robert's final command. If the king perished, Ned would be in direct conflict with the Lannisters, particularly if Joffrey or the Queen refused to accept him as regent. The weight of it pressed on him like an iron mantle. For a moment, he stood by the lone candle on his desk, candlelight dancing over his features. He could summon Renly, show him the document, or even share it with the small council. But something warned him that it was too soon. The city was a tinderbox of tension, and if word spread that Robert had effectively named Ned ruler in all but name, the Lannisters might move swiftly to secure power. Perhaps they would even accelerate Robert's demise. Ned's hand trembled slightly as he rolled the document again and hid it in a secure chest, locking it tight. There was no turning back now. He would respect Robert's will, but he had to tread carefully. Tomorrow, he would begin making quiet inquiries, Perhaps approach Renly and gauge his stance. Stannis should be informed as well, for he was the rightful heir if something about Joffrey's lineage proved false. But each step carried the risk of igniting a fire that could consume them all. He blew out a weary breath, mind racing with possibilities. In that moment, the flicker of the candle seemed to represent the king's waning life, fragile and easily snuffed out. Ned sank onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. He silently prayed to the old gods for guidance, for the sake of the realm and Robert's soul. Elsewhere in the Red Keep, Cersei guided Robert back to his bed, summoning 2 servants to assist in removing his boots and cloak. The king collapsed onto the mattress, panting. She dismissed the servants with a sharp gesture, then knelt beside him, her voice low and urgent. "Robert," she said, forcing a semblance of pity into her tone. "You mustn't wear yourself out with these theatrics." He glared at her, though exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision. "Don't pretend you care," he gasped. "I know you despise me." She placed a hand on his forehead, feeling the heat radiate from him. Beneath her calm facade, she noted how dangerously high his fever was climbing. "Hush. Save your breath. If he died tonight, all her careful timing would be thrown into chaos." She needed him to linger just a bit longer, to ensure her position remained unassailable. He coughed again, gagging on his own saliva. She reached for a cup of water at the bedside. This time, she refrained from adding anything extra. He drank weakly, then let his head roll back. His breathing came in labored bursts. Cersei watched him, thoughts churning. The parchment he had just signed might jeopardize everything if Ned Stark wielded it. She would have to find a way to neutralize it. Perhaps claim that Robert had not been of sound mind, or that the seal was forced. But Stark's honesty made him a formidable opponent. He would not lie about the matter. When she left Robert's chamber, she strode briskly to her own rooms, passing a handful of guards bearing the lion sigil. Once inside, she dismissed her maids, ensuring her solitude. A single candle burned on the table by her bed. She paced the floor, the train of her gown whispering against the stones. Her heart thudded in her chest. If Robert lingered too long, Ned would gather support or even evidence that could threaten her. If Robert died too soon, suspicion might fall on her shoulders before she'd fully cemented her plans. She reached for the locked coffer where she kept the poison, her slender fingers sliding across the intricate golden filigree. Carefully, she opened it. Inside lay a trio of small vials and pouches, each containing a substance more insidious than the last. She selected one, a liquid distilled from a dangerous root, potent enough to cause a slow but relentless breakdown of the body. She held it up to the candlelight, swirling the fluid so it caught faint, amber gleams. The question gnawed at her. How to deliver another dose without Ned's testers intercepting it? She'd grown adept at slipping powders into Robert's personal wineskin, or mixing minute quantities into water. But with rumors of poison now swirling, the Watchers had become more vigilant. Pycelle had begun tasting some of the king's drinks himself, though he remained oblivious to the smaller manipulations that occurred after testing. She knew she needed but a fraction more to push Robert closer to the edge. His body was so compromised that any strong enough dose might finish him in days, rather than weeks. Yet the timing must be perfect. If Robert died before Ned revealed that damning parchment, none could contest that Joffrey was the rightful heir, and Cersei would reign as Queen Regent until Joffrey came of age. She let out a slow breath, returning the vial to the coffer. Not yet, she told herself. Another day or two. Once Ned's Watchers grew complacent, she would find an opening, a moment late at night when the king demanded a drink from a fresh pitcher. She closed the coffer, locked it, and stowed it away carefully, her mind racing with contingencies. The night wore on, heavy clouds gathering over King's Landing, until at last a soft rain began to patter against the castle walls. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a quiet threat of storms to come. Robert, half conscious in his feverish state, mumbled incoherent words about hunts and wars, while Pycelle dozed in a chair nearby, stirring every so often to check the king's pulse. Servants tiptoed through the halls. Varys, walking with measured steps, carried sealed notes for his network of informants. Littlefinger entertained a pair of visiting merchants in a side room, discussing city finances with a smooth tongue, all the while gleaning rumors about the king's condition. Renly paced his own quarters, racked with worry, uncertain whether to trust Cersei or Ned. Morning broke with a dreary, rain-swept sky. Ned awoke stiff and weary, having dozed off at his desk. He changed into a fresh tunic and headed for the king's apartments, stopping only to inquire with a servant whether Robert had made it through the night. The servant's pale face told him the king was still alive but had not improved. Ned entered quietly, finding Robert in bed, body trembling under thick blankets, a deep flush on his cheeks. The king blinked groggily at him. "Morning," Ned said softly, his voice catching at the sight of his friend's condition. "Did you sleep at all?" Robert shook his head, a feeble motion. "Nightmares. This thrice-damned fever." He coughed. "Pycelle's gone to gather more herbs. None of them help." He winced, swallowing. "The thirst is the worst. My throat's always dry." Ned retrieved a nearby pitcher of water, tested it himself, mindful of the vow to check for poison, then poured a small amount into a cup. He offered it to Robert, who drank greedily. The king coughed again afterward, but nodded in gratitude. In the doorway a figure appeared, Jaime Lannister, clad in partial armor, golden hair gleaming in the torchlight. He regarded Ned with open distaste. "Lord Stark," Jaime drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "I came to see my sister, but I see she's not here." "Checking on the king, are we?" Ned set the cup down, ignoring Jaime's tone. "Yes, as the Hand, it's my duty." Jaime's lips curved into a thin smile. "Your duty? Indeed. And how is our mighty king this morning?" He directed the question more at Robert than Ned. Robert scowled at Jaime. "I'm still breathing, if that's what you wanted to know. Off with you, unless you plan to stand there gawking." Jaime spread his hands. "I only meant to ensure you were in good hands. My sister is concerned." The emphasis on the final word made Ned's hackles rise. Jaime gave a mocking little bow and departed, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Once he was gone, Robert exhaled shakily, anger contorting his features. "Those bloody Lannisters, everywhere I turn." A wheezing cough followed, and he sank deeper into the pillows, exhaustion overwhelming him. "Ned, if this is the end." He paused, eyes flicking closed. "Protect them, my children." Ned felt a vice tighten around his heart. He nodded, though Robert's eyes were shut and might not see it. "I will," he said, voice thick with emotion. Robert drifted into a half-sleep. Ned stayed by his bedside a while longer, wrestling with the knowledge of the document in his keeping. If Robert truly believed the Lannisters untrustworthy, and if Cersei was indeed behind this slow murder, Ned had to prepare to act swiftly the moment Robert breathed his last. But how to marshal enough power to stand against the Queen and her allies, with only a handful of northern guards at his disposal? He left the king's apartments and returned to his own, only to find Renly waiting for him just outside the door. The younger Baratheon looked nervous, twisting a ring around his finger. He glanced up and down the corridor before speaking in a low tone. "Lord Stark, a word?" Ned gestured for him to come inside. They settled in a small sitting area. The window shuttered against the drizzle outside. Renly cleared his throat. "I fear Robert's time is short. I love my brother, but we must be pragmatic. If he passes, Joffrey will sit the throne. Yet I have grave doubts about Joffrey's ability to rule. He's not the most even-tempered boy. Perhaps it would be best if he were guided by someone more, shall we say, capable." "Daemon." Ned tensed. "The king has named me as protector of the realm until Joffrey comes of age. I assume he means for me to guide the boy." Renly leaned in. "Yes, but you know how Cersei will react. She'll fight you. And if it comes to conflict, do we want the realm torn by a power struggle? There's another option." He glanced around, as though the walls might have ears. "We could place Myrcella on the throne, or even Tommen. Someone more pliable. Or we could rally round another Baratheon." Ned narrowed his eyes. "You mean yourself?" Renly spread his hands. "Stannis is older, true, but he has no friends at court, no connections here. I, at least, have spent time in the capital, built relationships. If it comes to a contest for the crown, I would be better positioned to hold it and keep the peace." Ned stood, anger flickering. "You speak as if Robert is already dead, and you'd set aside the rightful line of succession." Renly rose as well, voice tight. "I speak as one who loves my brother and sees the realm's danger. If he is truly Robert's son, so be it. But if not, do we want Cersei's bastard on the throne? It could plunge the Seven Kingdoms into chaos." Ned clenched his fists. The ugly truth that had haunted him ever since he noticed the differences in the Baratheon children flared in his mind. He had to be certain, yet now was not the time to reveal his suspicions. "I will do what is honorable for the realm, Lord Renly. But I will not conspire against Robert's children in secret." "Them?" Renly's expression flashed with frustration. "Honor will mean little if the Lannisters seize power. Think on what I've said." He turned and strode from the room, leaving Ned with a bitter taste in his mouth. The day wore on, each passing hour a fresh torment for Robert as he battled fevers and chills, drifting between lucidity and delirium. Cersei visited him often, always with a measured, calm facade. Ned hovered in the background, silently observing, always checking the king's drink or meal before Robert took it. On several occasions, Robert's servants seemed to vanish just when they were needed, replaced by new faces wearing the Lannister sigil. Ned spoke to Jory, instructing him to keep watch, to trace each new servant's origins. But the labyrinth of tasks and rotating staff in the Red Keep made it a daunting challenge. Late in the afternoon, thunder shook the castle, and rain beat down in sheets, turning the courtyard into muddy puddles. A gloom settled over King's Landing, and the wind carried the scent of storm-tossed seas. In the king's bedchamber, the drumming of rain on the shutters seemed to mirror Robert's labored heartbeat. Pycelle administered a new herbal brew, but the king spat it out after one taste, cursing its foulness. Cersei stood nearby, arms folded, quietly seething at the disruption of her carefully laid plans. She had not yet found the right moment to deliver another potent dose, for Pycelle lingered incessantly, and Ned's men hovered whenever Robert ate or drank. Nightfall brought no respite. Robert's breaths became shallow, and his raving dreams returned. Joffrey was kept at a distance, annoyed at being barred from the king's presence. Sansa, starry-eyed, still tried to catch glimpses of the prince she believed her future husband. Arya complained the corridors were too crowded with Lannister guards for her to move about freely. Myrcella and Tommen heard only whispered rumors that father was sick. Ned sensed that the city itself held its breath, bracing for the moment the news would ring out that King Robert Baratheon was dead. He prayed it would not come to that. But as the lightning flashed outside his chamber window, illuminating the towers of the Red Keep, he felt fear coil in his stomach. If Robert died now, everything would unravel. The vow Ned had made to become protector would pit him squarely against the Queen and her father, Lord Tywin. And if Renly or Stannis staked their claims, the Seven Kingdoms might well descend into the carnage of civil war. A massive thunderclap rattled the panes. Ned pressed his palm to the cold glass, gazing at the storm-lashed courtyard below. He thought of Winterfell, the stark but honest land he called home. Here, in King's Landing, the illusions of power and the stench of corruption intertwined like serpents. Robert had once swept through these halls with the vigor of a conquering hero. But now that same man lay broken, undone by a cunning so subtle that even Ned, with all his wariness, could not see the poison's source. Somewhere in the depths of the castle, Cersei Lannister prepared her next move. Beyond the walls, Renly Baratheon wrestled with ambition. And within the king's chamber, Robert clung to life through another torturous night, his fevers rising like the storm clouds over Blackwater Bay. The hours stretched interminably, the pounding rain weaving a funeral dirge that seeped through the stone corridors of the Red Keep, heralding the shadow of death inching closer to the Iron Throne.